Hello. Good evening. I'm Mick Brown. I'm a writer for the Daily Telegraph, and I'd like to welcome you all to this evening with Sebastian Faulks. It's lovely to be able to greet a live audience in the theatre here, and also to greet those simultaneously tuning into the event at home, wherever home may be. As this event is exclusive to you, Telegraph subscribers, I'd like to thank you for your ongoing commitment. I also need to do a bit of housekeeping. For those watching at home, you can make the video full screen by clicking on the square at the bottom right. And you can submit questions if you scroll down to the Q&A box, and these will be fed through to me. I'll be talking to Sebastian for 40 minutes or so before inviting questions from you, the audience. And for those of you in the room with us, when asking a question, please wait for the microphone so that everyone can hear you at home. After all that preamble, it's an enormous pleasure and privilege tonight to be welcoming one of Britain's most eminent and acclaimed authors. Sebastian actually started his career as a Telegraph journalist, would that we could all follow in his footsteps. But he came to international prominence in 1993 with the publication of The Marvellous Birdsong. Since then, he's written more than a dozen novels, notable for the variety of their subject matter, but the constancy of their brilliance. He now has a new novel, as I'm sure you all know, Snow Country, set in Austria in the early to mid-years of the 20th century. And it's absolutely terrific. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Sebastian. I think we should have a round of applause welcoming him.
Thank you, Mick, and good evening to everybody here in the Telegraph and to all of you at home. It's great to be back in the Telegraph. I used to work, as Mick said, many, many years ago as a very, very junior reporter on the diary column of the Daily Telegraph. And then I switched to the Sunday Telegraph in about 1983, where I was a feature writer for 3 years. The best 3 years of my journalistic life. But it seems like a different era. It was in Fleet Street, literally, and the paper was printed on site, thunderous presses, 19th century presses going in the basement in the evening, and a huge number of journalists were employed. And we made tons and tons of money too, mostly through the small ads, but it was a very profitable enterprise and enormously good fun. And working as a journalist, which I did at the Telegraph and then after at the Independent for some years, about a total of about 15 years in all, was not only hugely enjoyable, and I met some wonderful people through it, but really very helpful to me in terms of finding stuff out. And I think the biggest lesson I learned from journalism was that if you just pick up the phone, people will tell you things. And they shouldn't really, but they do, and they're keen to help.
Don't give the secret away. This is the great journalist trick.
Sometimes you think, you really shouldn't be telling me this. Yes. I know I've said it's off the record, it's not attributable, but please, but they go on and on. And it was enormously good fun.
But you were saying earlier on when we were just talking earlier, you were saying you missed the companionship of the newsroom and the newspaper. I think once you've got that printer's ink in your veins, actually, it never fully drains away. And writing, as you do, is a very solitary life, isn't it? It's a very different life.
It's very different. And when I started, well, I wanted to be a novelist before I became a journalist. So I had conceived this great ambition as a sort of spotty teenager that I would be a great novelist. And then when I was 21, I wrote my first, in inverted commas, great novel, and guess what? It was really terrible. I then thought, well, I've got to make a living, I've got to pay the rent, so I became a teacher for a bit in London, and then I started doing little bits of journalism, and then I got a job on the Telegraph. And yes, of course, it was the people I met. I mean, journalists are much more fun than writers, really, than novelists, because they know more, and they're more modest, and they're more humorous. So if you have to spend an evening with 6 journalists or 6 authors, pick journalists every time. It did become, the higher up journalism you get, the more you get sucked into management and meetings, and that becomes quite tedious if you're not that kind of person, which I really wasn't. And so when I finally left journalism in the early 90s and got to live my dream of being in my little padded cork room with just my thoughts and to write novels. I was, fantastically happy for a long time. But after a while, you think, not all colleagues were ghastly, and I wouldn't mind a meeting. I wouldn't mind seeing someone, just a bit of a chat around the water cooler. Did anyone else see that thing on TV last night? So it's a push and pull. It's to get the perfect balance in life is always difficult.
Well, you're always very welcome to pop back in here whenever you feel like it. And
I don't think I know how it works. They don't seem to have any typewriters down there.
No typewriters. We don't know what typewriters are.
I can't hear the thunder of the presses in the basement either.
It occurs to me, though, one thing that journalism would be a good preparation for a novelist, a particular kind of novelist, and certainly for what you do, is, as you said, that ability to pick up the telephone to find things out, the curiosity about the world. And one of the most striking things about your books is this detail about the world and this fastidious attention to detail that, and in the new book where you're talking about Vienna, and one feels that the railway timetables intimately. You know what was being served in this restaurant at this time. And I get the sense that you've both spent a lot of time poring over dusty newspapers of record, but at the same time stamping the streets of Vienna. And this, to me, seems like the ideal life. But is that what you enjoy doing about writing?
Yes, I do enjoy research, but research plays a sort of odd... It's not just finding stuff out that you then put in. Sometimes research gives you ideas for what you might put in. And for instance, when I was writing a book called On Green Dolphin Street, which around about the year 2000, it's set in Washington and New York in the 1959, 1960. I spent some time doing reading up on the period, and I was a kid. I was 7 years old in 1960, so I didn't really know what the world was like, but I had a sort of dim idea of grown-ups drinking a lot of cocktails and smoking a lot of cigarettes, and I did have a dim memory of the Kennedy-Nixon election and that very famous television debate. So I went over to Washington, I went to New York quite a bit, and when I was there trying to recapture the feeling of the period at that time, that was very helpful to me. But when I came back to London to start writing it, I found that after a bit I'd sort of run out of story. And the only way I could discover what Mary felt about Frank, or Frank would say to Charlie, was to go back there. So I ended up sort of commuting backwards and forwards like a sort of mad
to get back
David
into the
Frost.
characters, as it were.
And so I'd go to these sort of old-fashioned steak restaurants, and I'd think, well, Mary, my main character, she's not going to really want to eating a sort of 3-pound T-bone steak, is she? But maybe Frank does want to. So why is that? Okay, he was brought up in the Depression. He was poor. Maybe he's brought up in Chicago, where the sort of stockyards are and all the cattle came from. And so research plays a sort of two-way thing. It's not just finding out facts. It's giving ideas into the story.
Right.
And likewise with Birdsong, I knew that, I knew it's about the First World War, obviously, but I wanted to have a period beforehand in which these places which became very famous, like, the Battle of the Somme River and Thiepval and all these places which are famous in English history as sort of terrible words in our history. They ring, the Somme has the resonance for us that sort of Auschwitz or Hiroshima had for other people. But, there was once a time when the Somme was just a river, rather sort of boring part of France going through flat fields and so on. And I was interested in trying to see what it was like before it became famous or known with this terrible sonority. And so I went there and spent a lot of time looking around, and I knew my English character had to be there before the war, but I couldn't find any reason for him to be there. Why would he be in this farming, this rather sort of boring part of France? And then I was staying in Amiens, and I was just about to give up the whole idea of a novelist set in the First World War. It seemed such a ridiculous thing to be trying to do anyway. And then I bought this book about the history of Amiens, a very boring book with lots of pictures and lots of stuff about the textile trade. And then I suddenly thought, textiles, now I can see a connection between London and Amiens. Maybe he's not learning to be a farmer. He's in the textile business, Lancashire, London, cotton mills. And suddenly I was aware, and at that moment I also was walking up a street, and I saw a house where I said, well, he's going to have a love affair, but he's going to have a love affair. Of course, it's going to be with the wife of his employer. And here's the house in which it's going to happen. And suddenly it all started happening. So the research again, kind of fed the story.
That must be really exciting, isn't it? When
a great moment.
those pieces start falling into place that you couldn't have anticipated. As you say, you couldn't design those. They just
No,
roll
you
on
have to
one
go.
after the other. You have to go.
You have to go. You have to wear out your shoes. You have to put in the hours, and you have to go through the long periods of thinking this is a complete waste of time. And then suddenly, when it happens, I remember I almost ran back to the car. I had a little Fiat, tiny little car, and I didn't have any paper, so I fiddled in the glove compartment, and I pulled out the Fiat manual, the driver's manual, and I started scribbling in the driver's manual the very words in which I knew this love affair would happen.
That's really interesting, but it strikes me also that it's not simply a question of you go to New York or you go to Vienna and you immerse yourself in the geography, you immerse yourself in the architecture, but you're immersing yourself in the geography and the architecture as it is now in the late in the 21st century. Whereas in the new book here, Snow Country, which we should say deals, doesn't it, primarily with, or it's in the wake of Freudian psychiatry and things that flow from Freudian psychiatry. And you've got a conversation between a journalist and the director of a clinic that he goes to visit about Freud and about the best way of tackling human pain. We know a lot about that now. We have our own ideas about that now, but you have to somehow put yourself back in 1914 and imagine that conversation without the knowledge that you now have. Is that a challenge? How do you do that? Do you understand what I'm asking you there?
Yeah. That's the job, really. And don't forget that this is the second book in a projected trilogy, if I'm spared. And most of the research that I did was for Human Traces, a book which came out in 2005. So with that, I really started at the beginning of the history of psychiatry, which really began in the early 19th century in Italy and France, and was caught up with in this country in the mid-19th century, when in a very typical Victorian, optimistic and inclusive gesture, we decided that every county would open a lunatic asylum, and that the so-called lunatics from all the towns and villages would be brought in so they could be cared for and looked after. But unfortunately, no one had really thought through very carefully. No one knew what on earth the matter with these people was, or how to diagnose it, or what to do with it. So people came in there some of whom had epilepsy, some of whom had deep-lying depressions, some of whom had all sorts of nervous illnesses, mental illnesses, and some physical. And nobody really knew the difference between mania and depression and psychosis, which was a word that didn't exist in those days. So eventually this became, and sometimes people were just taken into these asylums who were too difficult to deal with at home. They were unbalanced or disturbed or over-emotional, and sometimes people would just dump illegitimate children or blind or deaf or dumb kids. And so essentially by the end of the 19th century, these asylums had just become warehouses for looking after people who were difficult. They were sort of the alternative to the workhouse in a way. And then in what you have there were some very clever and very hard-working psychiatrists working through the 19th century, but the beginnings of the medicine were incredibly slow and very, very difficult. It was so hard to begin with. It was just a description. You just had to see there seem to be certain groups of symptoms which sit with other groups, and this is how medicine progresses. You just see that these symptoms seem to sit with this, and these symptoms seem to sit with that. And then you begin to describe a syndrome or a group of illnesses which can be actually categorized. You're still a very long way of finding a cure. Very, very long way. And then at the end of the 19th century, you have this breakthrough in Vienna where Freud, a lot of what Freud was working on in his early dramatic and very impressive case histories was available, really, in general medicine, in philosophy, because there is a sort of overlap. This is what's so fascinating about psychiatry, that it does overlap with other disciplines, with with neurology, obviously, but also with the way we think about the world and our idea of people and what they are. So philosophy has a bearing on it as well. And Freud produced these wonderful case histories in which very distressed young women would come to him with florid symptoms of pains and stammerings and stutterings and absences and weird smells beneath their nose and tremblings in their hands. And he persuaded them that they all suffered from something called hysteria, which was essentially the repression of emotions which they'd not been able to deal with and which had sort of basically gone bad in their mind and in their body, and had then found expression in these morbid ways. None of which was true, unfortunately, because we don't really believe that hysteria actually existed now. And most of these people, it can be shown, were actually suffering from what we would now call types of neurological illness. One of them had Tourette's syndrome, probably.
Right.
And Freud had worked with Mr. Tourette himself in Paris, so he really should have seen it. A lot of them had various kinds of epilepsy. But what Freud did, which was great, which was to show that the interrelatedness between the body and the mind, and how it's a really bad idea to suppress emotions because they can express themselves in multiple different ways and long after they have been suppressed. And that was a great insight. What was terrible about Freud was that he was so ambitious that he believed he was the Newton of the mind and that he could lay down universal laws, just as Newton's law might say, all objects attract other objects in inverse proportion of the square of the distance between them. So Freud tried to lay down laws which said, all physical symptoms expressed such are the function of the inverse proportion to which other feelings have been suppressed. And then even worse than that was that his laws, which he tried to formulate, were then taken by psychiatrists treating people with very serious inherited genetic illnesses like schizophrenia. So this particularly happened in America. So if you took your child aged 20, 21, which is characteristically the time at which a young person will develop delusions, will begin to hear voices, an incredibly stressful, upsetting time for a parent, there were certain hospitals in America at which you would take your child in and say, I don't know what's happened. I'm losing my child. They just behaving in this strange way. They talk to the air, they talk to voices. They don't hear me anymore. And one of the first things one of the psychiatrists would tell you is, that's your fault for being a bad parent. And this was extraordinarily destructive and upsetting. But on the other hand, Freud's later writings, so we don't have all this to be a lecture about Freud, do we? Freud's later writings about psychology and humanity in general were incredibly enlightening and are still very useful, I think, to lots of practicing psychologists now.
Yeah, I think one legacy of Freud is that in his day, there was the catch-all diagnosis of hysteria. Now, today's psychotherapists, it's the catch-all diagnosis of post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And repressed memory is what is now the word for what Freud was doing. Repressed memory coming up, and
which is also tricky because
very tricky.
You can persuade people that they remember things they don't really remember.
Absolutely, no, it's a very, very dangerous
That's
thing.
That's another rabbit hole we probably shouldn't go down.
No, we won't go down there. But I do find it, just to dwell for a second on this, because I do find it particularly interesting, these ruminations you have, if that's the right word, on consciousness, and I'm going to have to read my notes here because I wouldn't be able to say it otherwise. The sense that every individual is undifferentiated from the next, all part of some universal consciousness, as it were, born each minute into some loop of eternal return. And you have one character saying, dear God, may my consciousness be individuated, may it be real, so that I may die at last. I mean, appalled at the prospect of being his consciousness manifest in time. We're edging here towards much more long-standing ideas, philosophical ideas about reincarnation, aren't we? And the reincarnation of the soul, or the reincarnation of Atman in Hindus. Do you believe in reincarnation?
Not specifically, no. I mean, I don't believe that there is an individual soul that one person has, which is incorporated into a body in the 17th century in Java, which reappears in a body in the 19th century in Bolivia. But we should say also that, you know, we're making this sound very philosophical and rather sort of heavyweight and very
It's
abstract.
not. It's a fantastic love story.
I just want to,
But we're going to get to that in a minute.
I just want to say that the sort of, I do like books which make you think, and I do try to write books which have, you know, really stimulating and complicated thoughts in them. But my job as a novelist is to try to dramatize these things and try to embody them in the lives of men and women that you can identify with, whose story you can follow, whose emotions you care about, and so on. And that is the trick, and that's well, it's not the trick, it's the job. I mean, it's really hard to do. And people have been very nice about this book, and I think the consensus is that I've managed it here, that the thought, as it were, doesn't overbalance into the drama and the story, which maybe in Human Traces, maybe there's too much thought, though I remain fond of that book. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, neurologically, I mean, I have read an awful lot about this, as you can probably tell, but I've read an awful lot from a completely scientifically ignorant base. I mean, I somehow managed to go through all my school days without one single lesson in biology, not one, and scant few in physics and chemistry either. But the theory is that the idea of the self is essentially a myth. And the idea that, I mean, I don't want to bore on too long, but Descartes, you know, the great French philosopher, I think, therefore I am, that is now viewed as a sort of completely the opposite of what is the truth. It is I am, and therefore, among other things, I think. That would now be the consensus of scientists. And that we are basically just a skin, a dermis, in which there are cells which have been generated by all sorts of genetic impulses, and that most of what we pass on and inherit is sort of junk genes and bacteria and just little cells and genes clamoring for self-expression and to be passed on. But at some point, and this is the interesting bit, at some point, some glitch in human evolution enabled humans to remember and to become self-aware. And this faculty, while essentially delusional, was incredibly useful and very, very useful to us in our evolutionary progress. Because really, it now seems that Homo sapiens not only coexisted with Neanderthals, with whom we mated extensively. I am 3% Neanderthal. And it's likely that a lot of Neanderthal genes have fallen out of my genome now. So at some point, I might have been something like 20. But not just with Neanderthals, but other early humans, of which we seem to discover a new one almost every week. A new one in China, there's one in Russia, there's one in Indonesia, small guys. And in order to outbreed or out-eat these people in classic, you know, Darwinian terms, we didn't need to have the Sistine Chapel or all the symphonies of Mozart. But there was some freak, and it's that gave us this sense of self and this ability to remember where we had been and what we've been told to do and who we are, which, so far as we know, other creatures don't have. Dogs certainly don't have it. And there's some suggestion that some of the sort of higher apes have it to some extent. What we don't know, and we will never know, is to what extent the extinct human species, our cousins, had it. I suspect they had it to some considerable extent. The theory is that Neanderthals buried their dead and that they had the ability to speak. And speech, if you have speech, you can hear, and if you can hear, you probably get to remember to some extent. So maybe it wasn't a single glitch, a single evolutionary development, a single mutation. Maybe it was a combination of these things. But it is, so far as we know, I'm sorry, the very long rambling answer. So far as we know, it is the sort of Homo sapiens thing. This is our superiority, this consciousness. But the complication is that scientists think that the sense of self is essentially a delusion, and that it doesn't really exist, and we don't really have a self at all.
But nonetheless, we have to live in it. And
We live with it, and it's useful to us. It's a useful fiction.
I mean, the Snow Country, I mean, it unfolds against this sort of epic tableau, really, of war and strife and politics and love. And if we are just players on a stage and our little lives are rounded with a sleep, as Shakespeare said, within that, we have a myriad of consolations and solaces, don't we, to sustain us as human beings. And the foremost of them is love. And love is something which you write about very beautifully and very touchingly. Tell me about how important is love in your own life?
I would say all important, really. I think that the reason I've written a lot about love between men and women, or romantic love, as it were, is because it's one of the few feelings that enables most people to feel that they have transcended the limits of life. And our life can be quite mundane, and then we die, as we know. And when someone is dying, there's this terrible temptation to say, well, I remember this with my father, when he was dying, thinking, well, looking at all the pictures in the album and all the holidays when he was healthy and fit and on the beach and throwing a ball and having a beer and so on. Well, that was all just a sort of mockery, really, because he was going to die like this, and it was all going to be curtailed. And you have to fight very hard, I think, not to give way to that feeling, because the fact that people die and that we have this brutal, completely inconsequential ending to our little lives does not mean to say that they don't have value. It does mean to say they don't have meaning, but that's a different question. Our lives can still have value, and the moment at which I think you sense a value and an uplift in your life is through love, principally. And I remember when our first son was born, feeling this extraordinary sense of being elevated into a sort of a slightly better creature than I had been before, because my feeling for this little boy was so extraordinarily profound and exhilarating and uplifting and joyful. And I thought, this isn't just me. And as I would walk down the street to go to the tube in the morning, I would walk past other people, knowing that 90% of them had had the same feeling. But it didn't devalue it for me. On the contrary, the fact that I shared this feeling with everyone else, or most other people, made it even better and more life-affirming and more uplifting. And I do think the sort of parental love is perhaps the purest and best form. But the trouble is, it's very hard to write about without becoming sentimental. And the thing is that your love for your children does have an element of sentimentality in it. It just does. The funny words they say, the funny things they do. And I think that sentimentality is embedded in it, and you can't write about it honestly without acknowledging that. But readers of books don't really want to have sentimentality. They want something harder and more perilous. And that's why romantic love, or love between two people, I've written about men and women, but it works equally between same-sex relationships, is more exciting to write about in a way because it's more fragile. And because it has the sex element, of course, which is a massive complication. But it is exciting to write about. And people feel undoubtedly that when they are in the throes of loving somebody for the first time, it is a transcendent feeling.
How old were you when you had that?
I suppose the first time I sort of had that feeling when I was about 22, 23. Oh. And I very carefully don't write about my own life in my novels because I think it's a really bad thing to do. I don't know why, just everyone must set themselves their own rules. And I know lots of great novels are thinly disguised autobiographies. Proust, for instance, perhaps the greatest novel ever. It's all about him, really. And I know there's a great vogue for the so-called auto-fiction, but To me, I don't want to go there. It's just like, it's just not for me. But I have...
But you can share it with us, Sebastian.
Yeah, I share it with you. Share it with the Telegraph, my old employer. There's a moment in a book called Where My Heart Used to Beat, where the main character, who's a very damaged, strange man, is looking at his lover in her funny little room in Italy during the war. And he looks at her and he turns his eyes away and he sees that the whole room seems to be somehow glowing, as though there is some hidden light or candle going, and he can't see where this source of light is coming from. And that is lifted from life. But sort of sex, you wouldn't want to put in your sex life into a book, would you?
No, you could spare us that.
You really wouldn't want to do that, unless you were writing a great comedy.
I'm sure. No, we'll pass swiftly over that. You've said actually that happy endings are the province of airport novels. Although this book has a happy ending. I mean, it's
They may not have read it.
Happy-ish, let me put it that way. But it's an ending that will satisfy you, whatever your expectations may be. But if one thinks about great love stories, tragedy is a much better element than happiness, isn't it? As a conclusion of a great love story. They have to end... I'm thinking about, you mentioned Green Dolphin Street, which I love, is a wonderful book. And there you have this tremendous love story between Mary and Frank. It's published a long time ago, so I don't mind giving it away. It doesn't end happily, but it ends morally. I mean, they make the right moral choice, but it's not the choice that's going to guarantee them happiness. Although
we don't know, though.
We don't know. Maybe
the years may pass, and it may end up better.
Yeah.
We don't know. No, you're right. I mean, I think that happy endings are considered incredibly. They are the province of airport novels. They are considered down market, trashy, not for great literature. But I found with my last book, actually, Paris Echo, I was looking for a way to end it. It wasn't really a love story at all, but it seemed to me that I hadn't set out to write this, but two of the characters were edging towards one another. And I really was very awkward about this. And I thought, all my readers are going to desert me if I have a happy ending, because they're going to think I've become Catherine Cookson. This is terrible. But so the characters themselves express their reservations about what appears to be happening to them. But it wasn't the main point of the book anyway, which was about other things. But they did end. They ended happily. But also, I think the reader knows that these two people end up together, the man and the woman at the end of Paris Echo end together, but they're not going to be together forever. It's going to be they're going to have really great fun together for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they're going to really enjoy it. And when they separate, they're going to be great friends. So it was nice to write something like that. In Snow Country, since we seem to have, spoiler alerted, sort of gone out of the window now.
Don't give it away. Don't give it away.
But it's a much more romantic ending, and the people you hope will end up together do end up together. But it's 1934, and just after they've embraced, we're in Vienna 1934, the Anschluss is coming. Hitler has been elected in Germany. He looks out of the window and he sees police hurrying down the street and pushing someone into a corner. So the happiness is exceedingly ambivalent, and the reader knows.
Provisional.
The reader knows what the characters can't know.
Yeah. I'd like to dwell a bit on Birdsong, because that was a phenomenal success. I mean, you've written 1-2 novels before Birdsong came out. A phenomenon as much as a novel, really. Did that change your life enormously? Did that have a deleterious effect in any way on you?
No, not deleterious, utterly positive. And I think the thing is that Birdsong, when I wrote it, it was no one had written about the First World War for a long time, apart from Pat Barker, I should say, who's a great, lovely writer and a very nice woman who was in this area at the same time. But when I told my editor that I was writing a book set in the First World War, she was simply appalled. And I said, well, look, I'm 3/4 the way through it now. And she said, okay, well, we'll do the best we can. And that's my imitation of a Canadian accent, which was, Sue was Canadian. A great editor, very nice person too, a great friend. But it, you know, when I finished it, I felt that I had written something strong, but I never really expected anyone else to think so. I mean, as my late friend Ronald Harwood, the playwright, used to say, the norm of life is qualified disappointment. Qualified, you know, it's not, life isn't a complete letdown, but particularly in you know, writing books and plays, they never go over as well as you think. You think you've written a great thing, but other people, yeah, they quite like it, but something else came out at the same time, or they took their eye off it, or, you know, life is disappointing in the, you know, for books and plays. And then when the book came out, Birdsong came out, the reviews were, there were some very, very strong ones, but there are others which didn't really like it, or didn't really get it, or, you know. And then it sold okay in hardback, but not really great. And then it came out in paperback about a year later, and something then seemed to happen. It seemed to have, a word of mouth between the hardback and the paperback publication seemed to have given it a sort of push. And it popped up into the top 10 bestsellers, which is not somewhere I ever expected to see myself. And it stayed there, and then it stayed there. And 2 years later, it was still there. So it was a very slow thing. And also, I was 40. I had 2 small children, another one on the way. I'd been a journalist. I'd been around the block. You know, I wasn't going to get swept away with all this.
I mean, I guess it would have changed your circumstances considerably, financial circumstances. And,
yeah, I mean, what it meant
added
was
to your comforts in life. But
yeah, about 2 years afterwards, I realised that I probably wouldn't have to go back to journalism. But I kept on writing columns and doing freelance journalism for another 6 or 7 years afterwards for the money, basically.
Did it sort of fill you with a sort of apprehension about, oh my God, that's my yardstick now. If my next book doesn't sell X million copies, I'm a failure?
No, it was all a great experience. And it came out, Louis de Bernier published Captain Corelli's Mandolin about a year later. Yeah. And Louis is a very nice guy, I know him a little bit. And he wrote to me and I wrote to him and I admired his book very much. And I think the success of that book really freaked him out badly. I think he found it very difficult to deal with. And just by pure luck, I didn't. I found it utterly thrilling. Of course, I didn't write another novel after it. I wrote a book called The Fatal Englishman, which was 3 short biographies. And maybe in that there's a sense of not quite ready to go to another novel yet.
Right.
Though it's a book I liked and people liked as well. And, you know, massively journalistic, huge amount of research. And I was hoping that out of it would spin ideas for another novel, which did happen. And then I wrote Charlotte Gray afterwards. And, you know, of course I was very anxious about that. But I felt it was good. And there was a bit of backlash in the reviews, a bit of let's take this guy down a peg or two. But the sales were good and the book was good and people liked it and the readers liked it. And so, yeah, there's... If you have a very successful book, of course you have to live up to it, but that's fine. I was just the right age, I think. I said, fine, I can live up to it. I'm 41, that's no age. I can bloody well do this. And I'll write another bloody good one after that too. So it was just very lucky. If it had happened to me at 25, that would have been really different.
It might have been a different picture.
Yeah, I think very different. Yeah.
I mean, as we said at the beginning here, this is Snow Country is the second novel in a trilogy. It's taken what? 12 years, 13 years, 14 years between the two? Are we going to have to wait for another 12, 13 or 14 years?
No, definitely not.
Are you writing the third part?
No, I'm not writing it yet, but I'm writing another thing first, and then I will come to it after that.
But I'm sure you said that the last time, didn't you?
No, I mean, why would I write 3 books? Well, it's, you know, Human Traces and Snow Country are about simply why are human beings so weird? I mean, what is the matter with us? Why are we so strange? And, you know, that is an endless topic. And all the scientists and all the philosophers in the world will never come to the end of this topic. So there's at least 3 books in it. But my job, as I was saying before, is to make them dramatic, to make them interesting, to make them moving, to make you care about the people in them. And I have an idea of where I'm going with the third one, roughly when it will be set and roughly what the difference in it will be between it and the other 2. But as one of the reviewers said, I hope he doesn't wait another 15 years between this. I mean, I'll be quite old by then, and I won't. But it'll come. But I'm writing something else in the meantime, which is more light-hearted.
As I said, the human condition is an inexhaustible subject,
Well, of course,
really. That's what you do. Actually, this seems like quite a natural time to break off and see if there's any questions that anybody has. Let me ask the audience here first of all if there's anybody who'd like to ask a question. This is the point at which nobody dares to put up their hand until somebody else does. But you have, sir, yes.
Thank you. I'll stand up. Hopefully I won't get in the way of the camera completely. Thank you very much for organising tonight, and thank you for your words. You spent a lot of time talking about the human mind and the state of the human mind and how we're quite weird as a species. Do you get depressed that we don't seem to be getting any less weird? If you look around, you know, the main characters on the world stage at the moment, there are quite a lot of weird people, and perhaps more extreme. Do you get depressed or excited about that?
Well, this is a political question, really, and obviously it's very depressing, the way the world is going, but I try not to be depressed because there's no point in me being depressed, really. I'm not going to be... My job is to write books which entertain people and, you know, make them think and enjoy their lives or bear or tolerate their lives better in a possibly a richer way. You know, I can't go into all the politics of sort of populism and so on, and totalitarianism. Of course, you know, the Trump thing, I think we just can't even bear to look at it, but it was truly appalling. And, you know, China and Russia, you know, it's not good. However, I think that it's possible that in evolutionary terms, human beings may regress in some way. And if we have all these things we don't really use, all these pointlessly sophisticated mental abilities which we barely use, maybe they will be selected against by evolution. And maybe we will, in a short evolutionary time, say 5 million years, be slightly less complicated people and slightly happier people for that reason. And some of the symphonies will remain unwritten, but we have plenty of symphonies, really. And maybe we will come to a better arrangement with the planet on which we live, and we will pillage the planet less and kill one another less, because there will be evolutionary changes in the way we think. But in the short term, it's not good.
I've got some questions here coming in from an audience watching on their computer screens.
They're not talking about my socks. I hope my socks are invisible.
Are they cashmere?
No, it was a bit of the end of the week, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just
you know,
the random hand in the drawer.
Yeah.
I get it. So somebody, SP, shame we don't know everybody's first name. I'm interested to know how much time you spent researching for both Snow Country and Human Traces compared to the time writing. You sort of answered that by saying that you spend a lot of time thinking about these things, but how much time did you actually spend researching proportionate to the time writing?
Well, Human Traces is a huge amount. It took at least 5 years to write, and I was researching all that time. I mean, really starting from a very low base. And I actually employed 2 researchers to help me with various aspects of it, such as, you know, a character needs to go from the east coast of America to the west coast of America on a train in 1895. I mean, I really haven't got time to find out can you find it out for me? So I pay a researcher to find it. A poor guy, I was paying him by the hour, and he went into the British Library and he just found a book which told him everything. He came back and I said, okay, well, here's your check for 15 quid. You know? But other researches were just enormous, and meeting people and traveling. And I went to Africa, I went to America, I went to Vienna, I went to Austria, and just extraordinary. Whereas Snow Country, very little. I mean, I went to Vienna in December 2019. It was our wedding anniversary. And while I was there, I coupled the anniversary trip with a bit of research, which even takes a bit of swinging, but I managed to.
Yeah.
And I haven't been able to go back since because there's wretched COVID. So Snow Country is actually quite under-researched in terms of Vienna itself. But, you know, there are books, there's YouTube, there's, you know, Google Maps is incredible, really. Yeah. You know, you can walk the streets. Yeah. And Vienna is essentially a slightly sort of bogus city anyway. None of the buildings are really of the period in which they appear to be. It's very under-researched, Snow Country, but to me it was quite a challenge writing something under-researched, but in a way it was quite a liberation, because sometimes if you've done so much research, you're tempted to overshare. You have to tell yourself, this is not a travel article, it's a drama, it's a novel.
And the time actually writing, the time spent in front of the word processor or typewriter or...
It very much varies. I mean, it would vary. Well, once I'm up and running, it's pretty quick. I mean, I write 1,000, 1,200 words a day.
Do you?
So
what's your regimen actually? What time do you get up and get to the desk by?
I get up quite late. Times crossword has to be done before anything else can be done. A large amount of coffee has to go down. So I'm at the desk about 10.
Right.
And then through till about 2. And then a bit of a walk around, maybe a bit of tennis or shopping or helping out or doing stuff. And then 5 till 7 is a very good time, I find, early evening.
See, this is the journalistic training, Sebastian.
It's a completely journalistic timetable. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very good. Okay, what have we got here? Matthew, many of your books spend considerable time in the military sphere. Is that because of your own family? And do you ever worry about authentically relating the experience of soldiery? You do come from a military family, don't you?
Not sort of. They weren't professional military, but my father fought in the Second World War. I mean, he was a lawyer, but he was born in 1917, so he was just rising 22 in 1939. So he volunteered immediately, and he didn't come back for 7 years. And he had fought in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. So it was something that was in the background of growing up in the 50s and 60s, but not specifically to my family. All families, that's the generation we were. And my mother's father had fought in the First World War as a soldier on the Western Front, and then he was a war reporter. He worked for the Telegraph, actually. He worked for the Morning Post and then the Telegraph as a sport. He was a sports reporter, and they were running short of war reporters in 1945, so he volunteered, despite being quite considerable age, in his late 50s, I think, to go with the Americans out of Europe into Germany. And he was killed as a reporter crossing the Rhine in 1945. So this was in the background of my growing up, but also in the background of my growing up in the 60s was the Cold War and so on. Mm-hmm. It just seemed an obvious thing to think about. And reading books written by people in the 60s and 70s like Iris Murdoch, Anthony Burgess, Kingsley Amis, John Fowles. I mean, Fowles wrote about the war in the Magus, but they didn't write about it very much. I mean, Murdoch just touches on it a couple of times. I've just been reading a couple of her books. But it's notable by its absence, really. I think people didn't really want to think about it. They wanted to put it behind us, rather like Trump and COVID, just wanted to forget about it. As for getting it right, yes, of course you worry. But one of the things you do, I understood quite quickly from researching a lot, was that, wars are just fought by ordinary people like you and me. And that's the first thing. So there's nothing essentially glamorous or heroic about the people who fought them. There's something very unfortunate to have to go and kill people and risk being killed. The most horrible thing you can do. But they were ordinary, and therefore ordinary experience is attainable, it is comprehensible, and it is get-atable by a journalist. And the other thing is that there was no one experience of war. Everyone's experience is completely different. Some people, never went over the top in the First World War. Some people never saw any action in the Second World War at all. They were guarding the gasworks in Devon, or they were in stores or transport. Huge numbers of people were in, auxiliary occupations, not actually killing people. So I felt emboldened by the research. But of course, to answer your question, of course, one always feels a degree of trepidation and a degree of humility too.
About getting that.
About talking about things you haven't done. Of course.
Anybody else here in the audience who'd like to ask? Yes, sir. You at the back there.
Thank you very much for the information you've given us tonight. I'd just be interested to know, when you look at your novels, that there's such a wide variety of topics and plots. And, if you take Week in December or Paris Echo, or the latest one. Could you just tell us how you get the ideas and how you develop the plots and how long it takes you to do that for each for each book?
Well, thank you for saying how different they are. I've tried very hard to make them different for two reasons. One, because I want readers to be surprised, and I want them to go to the shop and buy the book. I don't want them to think, oh, it's another old folks, it's on the same old thing again. And secondly, because writing a novel is such a commitment. It's almost a physical task. If you haven't written a 400-page book, you've no idea how many keystrokes that involves, the piles of paper, the number of books, the miles you travel. It's a big physical as well as mental exertion, and you want to make sure that you're excited by something and that it's going to have the thoughts and ideas in the book and the characters and the action that's going to sustain you for 2 years in your head, talking to no one about it. And this is one of the exciting things when it comes out and you first read reviews and you think, I mean, whether they're good or bad, whether the reviewer has liked the book or not, they take it seriously. And it's very exciting to read someone in the Sunday Times or the Observer or sort of very grown-up newspaper or the Telegraph saying, you know...
Glad you said that.
That's right. Just suddenly remembered where I was. You know, Anton has suffered a great deal, but he's now coming, and you think, they believe in this little guy. I just invented this guy. He doesn't really exist. So it's a very exhilarating feeling. But where these people come from, I think they come from what the ideas come from. They come a lot from reading other books. They come a lot from watching television, talking with people, just this sort of constant flow of information. And just things click with you and you think, oh, and of course it comes from your own life. I mean, so Human Traces, and to some extent my whole interest in psychiatry came from when I was young, meeting, when I was aged about 12, a young man who was in the early stages of schizophrenia and being just completely freaked out and appalled by this as a kid and thinking that no one understands what's wrong with this guy. And those people were very unsympathetic as well and thinking, I've got to understand this one day. So there is a sort of, although my novels are not autobiographical, they are sometimes one's interest in something is prompted by something that happens to you in real life. And the book I'm about to start, I hope I'm about to start, if I can get it a bit more clear in my head, I read a tweet, can't get more vulgar than that, by Richard Dawkins. And it was a what if such and such. I won't tell you what it is, plot spoiler. And also, I'm superstitious about talking about things. And I thought, that's really interesting, really interesting. But he tweeted on a completely sort of scientific line. And I thought, well, I could make that human, and that would be... So the answer is you don't know, but all over the place. We're all omnivorous. I mean, we all take stuff in. And I think the key is trying to understand the difference between a thought and an idea. And a thought is just something you have or stuff people say. And an idea is something that makes you think, oh, yeah, if I rub that one up against that one and that one and that one and take the sister of the bloke I met there, but make the sister into a bloke and transpose it to Austria, So it's a sort of putting things together.
Then you've got a book. That's when you've got a book.
Yeah.
Here's a sweet question. This is from Caroline. Who is your top favourite character from all your books and why? Is there any character you've particularly fallen in love with? And perhaps one you've fallen desperately out of love with?
Well, Engleby is the most repulsive, horrible character that gives his name to a book.
It's a great character.
Yeah, he's my sort of evil twin, really.
Yeah.
And I like him because he's entertaining. And I think that you like characters in books who entertain you. You don't have the same criteria, the same standards for judging people in books that you do in real life. You don't want to spend a lot of time with someone who's sort of good sort in a book. You want to spend some time with someone who's thrillingly perverse or weird.
Right.
So I like Engleby. I like, there's a character in Human Traces who reoccurs in Snow Country called Kitty, who I like because she's before you meet her, she has been psychoanalyzed over a period of about 30 pages. And you know everything about her mind, her body, the shape of her kneecaps, her menstrual periods, her ovulation, her skin color, her hair, and everything about her. That she's been overseen by male doctors for a very, very long period. And eventually, she had to say something. She had to come into the room and say something. And I just didn't know what she was going to say. And so we opened the door into her room, and Thomas, one of the doctors, goes into her room. And I thought, so I just typed the first thing that came into my head, and she just came alive. She was so helpful to me. She was so vigorous, and she was so utterly dismissive of all the garbage that had gone before. She was such a lively young woman that I have a huge affection for her. And she reoccurs in Snow Country as an old woman, but she's still quite funny and still quite slightly disparaging of the attempts of others, or she's sort of pricking of pomposity. So I like her a lot.
It's interesting you say that you describe her mind and her body, because just recently you've said that you're not going to describe women's bodies anymore. Why did you make that decision? Is that for?
Well, I didn't really. Just to clear this up, we were talking, as people do now, a lot about cancel culture, woke culture, identity politics, all of that. And, I'm basically, my view is that novelists must feel free to invent and say what they like, and you can invent anything, but you better make it good. And if you're inventing things outside your own experience, readers are perfectly liable to say, well, does he really know what it's like for a, Bolivian in the 12th century female? You've got to make it good. But I also think that we do change. The world does change. We change what we feel we should do. We change what we feel is appropriate. We change the language that we use. I watched the film the other day of To Kill a Mockingbird for reasons I can't quite remember. But the language they use for African Americans in that, liberal, enlightened, nice people, it's not the language we would use today. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't use the words that Martin Luther King used. Society changes and writers change with it. And I simply said in an interview in Cheltenham that I had tried just in this book with one of the characters, Lena, the main female character, I just said, for an experiment, let us not have her physically described by a man. She's not really physically described very much at all. What characters look like isn't really terribly interesting anymore. It's not what, but that went out of fashion in the 1930s. But so what Lena looks like is described only by herself when she looks at herself in the mirror, and by a female colleague of hers who comments on her hair or her skin or whatever it might be.
Sure, I can see this is a very interesting authorial device. But is it that, or were you actually had women readers said to you, Sebastian, I don't like the fact that you're describing. No,
they hadn't.
I don't like the way you're describing this.
No, I tried to be ahead of the curve, and just to try it. But I reserve the right, absolutely, in a future book, to have another character, if it seems appropriate to the setting, described by a man looking on. I don't see any problem with that. I just thought I'd try it here, and to be honest, it made incredibly little difference. I found it, if anything, slightly liberating, and I really don't think the reader would notice if I hadn't pointed it out. It was then picked up by the Daily Mail and blah, 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 blah. But, that's not my point at all. But I do think that my writers should write what they want. They should feel free. But at the same time, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Well, well, let me give you an example. You mentioned cultural appropriation, which is an argument I find fundamentally ridiculous. But anyway, you wrote in Paris Echo, which I think is a terrific book, a really, really enjoyable book. And there, the principal character is an Algerian boy, young Algerian boy. You are not a young Algerian boy. Would you feel constrained now from writing in the voice of a young Algerian boy in light of the way in which culture seems to be shifting, as you say, time and language changes?
I don't think so. He's actually Moroccan, but no, but he was going to be Algerian, but I couldn't get into Algiers because the Foreign Office said don't go there. And it was anyway. I think it's all right, but I'm aware that even in Paris Echo came out 3 years ago, and I'm aware of a slight shift even then. But the two main characters in Paris Echo are a 19-year-old Muslim boy from Tangier and a 32-year-old American woman, and I am none of these things. And so at the time, it was the very early days of this discussion, actually. Well, not that early, but, it was very early when it became really active. And I was very sort of on the front foot. Yeah, fiction is cultural appropriation. Fiction is taking other people's lives and understanding them and revealing them, and that's what a novelist does. And I still, that is my basic position. But at the same time, I'd, take another example. I mean, would I write about a man of my age who was gay? Yeah, probably, but I'd think about it. And one of the reasons I think about it is because, gay experiences have been so well written about by gay writers. And I think it would look quite odd. I mean, I think it's one thing you can have a character who turns out to be gay. For instance, Iris Murdoch, I've just been reading her, The Bell, the main character, that is gay. So Iris Murdoch's a woman writing about a gay man, really? Is that appropriation? I don't know. Is she allowed to do that? Seems fine to me. But, I mean, now, with Alan Hollinghurst here and the wonderful novels Alan has written, it would be quite odd if I had a sort of...
But nobody would turn around to Alan Hollinghurst and say, you cannot write in the voice of a
No, they wouldn't say
heterosexual
that,
male,
no. But he...
And I'm sure he would feel incredibly constrained if somebody did try to say that to him.
Yes, I mean, he should. I don't think he would, though. I don't know. All I'm saying is I don't have any hard and fast rules about this. All I'm saying is that I think if you make choices as a writer, it's not out of weakness or that you've been beaten up by Twitter or something. It's because you're sort of sensitively reacting to where you are and what you feel you can do. But I would certainly, Paris Echo, I'd do that again,
Okay.
for sure, yeah.
I've got one more question. Does anybody else like to ask a question before I ask my last question? No? This is coming in from Kathleen. It's a sweet question, provocative question. Which book are you most proud of writing, and is it the one you made the most money from?
Well, you don't let a book out into the world unless you're proud of it and pleased with it. It's the best you can do. And I wouldn't insult the reader by giving them less than the best I can do. But of course, whether they think it's any good is a completely different matter. I did feel when I'd finished Birdsong that I'd written something quite individual and something that hadn't been done. But I never expected other people to share my opinion of it. And I did feel with Human Traces that it was just such a sort of epically long struggle to get that thing done. And there were times when I thought I'd never finish it. I had to give up having lunch to get away from the journalistic day. I just couldn't afford the time off in the middle of the day. And I have hundreds of maps and charts all around the room. And I did feel proud of that. And was it the one that made the most money? No, I think the one that made the most money probably was the James Bond book, actually. We haven't talked about
James
James
talk about
Bond.
that, did we?
No, but dear old 007, that is my pension. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Were you happy with the ending of the new movie? Have you seen the
what?
new
I haven't
movie?
seen it yet.
Oh, well, I won't give that away.
I understand that there's has a slightly terminal ending.
I
Reading between the spoiler alerts is quite easy to pick up.
I couldn't possibly say, Mr. Bond. Listen, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and this book is fantastic. And if Human Traces is a book you're particularly proud of, you should also be extraordinarily proud of this. And I commend everybody to read it. And thank you again, Sebastian Faulks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.